creation of knowledge about societies in the East, about the Orient, on the presumption that the East is static and undeveloped and irrational and magical, and Europe is rational and scientific and based on progress. That division, that's what we call Orientalism. Okay, that's what I mean by that. So that kind of thinking, is the context in which even Indians had to think about what it meant to be Indian or Muslim or Hindu and so forth. And that set of knowledge, Orientalism, was very important in enabling European imperialism. It produced a kind of condescending illusion of understanding and control for the British. And so the existence of this body of Orientalist knowledge made it very difficult for anyone to understand questions about Islam and worldly affairs outside of Orientalism. And the same problem applied if you were studying Hinduism. So figures like Syed Ahmad Khan and Iqbal were caught in that scholarly problem. And Iqbal, in fact, went to Cambridge in the steps of his teacher from Government College Lahore, who was a British Orientalist, this man called Thomas Walker Arnold. And he was also a great friend of Syed Ahmad Khan, and he was going back to England from Lahore to work in the India office, which is the government, the department of the British government that ran the empire in India. And he went on to serve in high academic and imperial government posts. After 1931, Iqbal's idea of a Muslim India was also much supported by his best friend in Lahore, this man, Muhammad Assad, whose son is the academic Dalal Assad, you may have heard of. So Assad was actually born as Leopold Weiss. He was an Austro-Hungarian Jew who converted to Islam. He had been an advisor to Ibn Saud in the 1920s and then fought with him and came to Lahore. And he went on to shape Pakistan's constitution and to serve in the foreign ministry of Pakistan too. I invoke him and Arnold to highlight the cosmopolitan and colonial intellectual context in which the idea of a Muslim nation state took shape, even though it was also very much about the local and anti-colonial mission of saving Muslims from domination by non-Muslims. It's complicated, right? So colonial ideas, however, generally shaped the evolution of political life on the subcontinent. The notions of difference at play were modern and new. These were not ancient hatreds. In the period of British rule, political identity was tied to religious, linguistic, and caste distinctions that were built into the colonial state through censuses, separate electorates, separate personal law, and all of those were shaped by British Orientalist study. So it's a kind of colonial social engineering. And that social engineering was partly motivated by fear, because after 1857, the British wanted to make sure that people in the subcontinent could never again form a bloc against their rule. So the First World War happens in 1914 to 1918, and it really fueled Iqbal's interest in Islam's potential as a social and political organization. To him, that war, it was a very, very destructive war, right? And to him, it showed that competitive nationalism produced only bad things: militarism, imperialism, indifference to religion. And so Islam instead seemed to offer a way of moving beyond nationalism towards something better, maybe a post-nationalistic world. He hoped that Muslim political autonomy would foster in one place a less divided and exploitative society based on an Islamic moral system that would serve both Muslims and non-Muslims. And in seeking to move beyond nationalism, Iqbal was not unique. There were lots of poets and critics who thought like him at the same time. So for instance, the war, First World War, also horrified the poet Rabindranath Tagore. And you can see him in his personal transformation, from a Victorian gentleman to an idea of an Indian nationalist, an authentic Indian. He delivered lectures criticizing that kind of competitive nationalism. During World War I, he was traveling in Japan and the US, and he was criticizing nationalism. And we know him as a nationalist. There are different kinds of nationalism, right? And he also articulated a very particular kind of love of homeland with unspecified borders. And Gandhi, we also know, was generally critical of Western civilization. British poets who served in the First World War were also critical of that kind of nationalism. They were disillusioned by the war. And the war became a kind of poetic touchstone for them in the same way that partition did for Urdu poets. And many of these British and Indian poets all met in London and Oxford and Cambridge. Tagore and Iqbal were both deeply knowledgeable about Western poetry too. So all this is to point to the global and anti-colonial dimensions of this story from the start. Partition is not just a South Asian story, it's part of world history. Punjab in particular was deeply influenced by global revolutionary movements. Banned literature was coming into the province secretly from all over the world. Punjabis in Punjab were hearing about racism against Punjabis living in California and Canada. So the Punjabi diaspora that the British helped create in the 19th century shaped what happened in Punjab in the 20th century. So partition kind of begetting partition. So inspired by the memory of 1857, Punjabis in California founded a party called the Ghadar Party in 1913. Ghadar means mutiny, right? That's what happened in 1857. So they published this magazine, Ghadar Di Gunj, which was very much full of poetry, revolutionary poetry. So some of you can read some scripts. This is Ghadar, it says Ghadar Di Gunj, Desh Di Vani, Desh Bhagda Di Vani, Ghadar Di Gunj, Bande Mataram. And the headline there is Lala Hardayal Ki Giraftari, on that one, if you can make out. So, but inside they were full of poetry. And these Ghadarites had a plan. They were going to go back to Punjab in 1914 when World War I was starting, and they were going to launch an armed rebellion in Punjab and free Punjab and free India. But British intelligence knew what they were planning. They had help from American intelligence agencies, and they were able to stop them when they landed. Many of them were arrested, many of them were immediately hanged, and many of them were imprisoned. So this is a handbill that was circulated by the party to show who were the martyrs for the cause in this moment. So if you can see, one of them is labeled Sohan Lal here. So he was killed in 1916, he was executed. So Amar Singh, one of his colleagues, wrote on his, they all expressed themselves with poetry, Urdu and Punjabi. Chadha Mansoor फांसी पर पुकारता इश्क बाजों को ये बेड़ा है तबाही का उठाए जिसका जी चाहे. So, and then many of them are sitting in prison in the Andaman Islands, and they're writing love poetry in the typical vein that we're familiar with, but the beloved is the motherland, okay? And they are exiled from that motherland, right? So I would like to now let us all hear another poem from the Ghadar Party movement. This one is by Kartar Singh Saraba, who was executed in 1915 at the age of 19. Just keep that in mind, young boy. And I would like to invite Janab Khalid Iqbal Sahab to please come and read this poem.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम, आदाब, नमस्ते। सबसे पहले मैं शुक्रिया अदा करना चाहता हूँ जनाब ताशी ज़ेश साहब का और डॉक्टर प्रिया सतिया का कि उन्होंने मुझे यह मौका दिया कि मैं करतार सिंह सराबा का कलाम पढ़ूँ। तो उनकी नज़म कुछ इस तरह से है, याद से जनाब जी। जो कोई पूछे कि कौन हो तुम तो कह दो बागी है नाम अपना। जो कोई पूछे कि कौन हो तुम तो कह दो बागी है नाम अपना। जुल्म मिटाना हमारा पेशा, गद्दार का करना है काम अपना। जुल्म मिटाना हमारा पेशा, गदर का करना है काम अपना। नमाज संधिया यही हमारी, पाठ पूजा भी सच यही है। नमाज संधिया यही हमारी, पाठ पूजा भी सच यही है। धर्म कर्म सच यही है यारो, धर्म कर्म सच यही है यारो, वही खुदा भी और राम अपना। शुक्रिया।
Thank you, sir. So Ghadar was different. It broke with the moderate stance of the Congress movement at the same time. Its aim was total independence. Congress was not asking for total independence. And Ghadar was willing to use violent tactics. And it inspired other movements that began to compete with Congress. So in 1915, a young student in UP, the United Provinces, not Uttar Pradesh yet, was reading in the newspaper and was outraged to read about the death sentence pronounced on one of the other leaders. And that young student was Prasad Bismil, who's the poet who would write Bhagat Singh's favorite poems, Mera Rang De Basanti Chola, and later he wrote Sarfaroshi Ki Tamanna as well. And you have to remember that the Russian Revolution is happening during the war too in 1917, and it's providing inspiration too that makes movements on the left seem more realistic than we think they are, looking back. The Amritsar massacre happens in 1919. At that point, Tagore renounces his knighthood. He and other Indian leaders are also aware of what these radical Ghadarites are planning and thinking in North America. This is a picture of Tagore. He's in the middle seat, meeting with Punjabis in Vancouver in the 1920s. You know that Lala Lajpat Rai was also in California during this period. He also met with Punjabis who were politically active in these years too. Meanwhile, Hasrat Mohani, who's such an underappreciated historical figure, I think, was also emerging as a vocal critic of the empire. You know him from famous ghazals like Chupke Chupke Raat Din, right? Ghulam Ali made famous. Yeah. Some of you may also know that he was a fiercely vocal anti-colonial journalist. And there's even rebellion in one, if you look at that famous ghazal of his, गैर की नजरों से बचकर सबकी मर्जी के खिलाफ वो तेरा चोरी छुपे रातों को आना याद है. I mean, this is a rebellious man. And he has an Urdu language newspaper that's part of this growing, very embattled, but expanding network of presses and publications that are criticizing everything that the British are doing. And the British are trying to censor it, but they keep outrunning it, right? So there's a kind of contest. And the British put Mohani in jail again and again for his criticisms. He would even not just write journalistic articles, he actually wrote ghazals that made political points. He wrote one in 1919 that criticized the Montague reforms of that year. Now 1919 is also the year that the Khilafat movement begins, and that was a joint Muslim League Congress movement to pressure the British to preserve the Turkish Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, because the Ottoman Empire was being broken up. The British had broken the Ottoman Empire during World War I. So the Muslim League and Congress have a joint meeting in Ahmedabad in 1921. And Prasad Bismil, the poet, was there. Mohani was actually the presiding chair of the League at the meeting. And both of them together urged that they must pass a resolution for Purna Swaraj, for total independence. But Gandhi opposed that idea. He favored a goal of dominion status within the empire instead. And after this meeting, because he made such radical speeches, Mohani was put in jail for 2 years. And in jail, he wrote devotional ghazals to the peers that he followed. And among those peers was Lord Krishna. And so some of those ghazals he wrote were in Urdu, and some of them were in a language that he called Bhasha, sort of like Brij Bhasha. So I'll just share one with you to give you a flavor of, please apne phones band kariye, thank you. Just to give you a flavor of the kind of mind we're working with, मनमोहन श्याम से नैनन लाग मनमोहन श्याम से नैनन लाग निस दिन सुलग रहे तन आग बिरहा की रैन निपट अंधियारे बिरहा की रैन निपट अंधियारे रोवत धोवत कटत जाग जाग प्रेम का रोग लगाई के हसरत प्रेम का रोग लगाई के हसरत Chupke Chupke Rande, he can work, polymath, right? So meanwhile, another poet, and another leader from the Khilafat movement was presiding over the Congress Party in 1923. And that was Muhammad Ali Johar. So you see, by focusing so much on Gandhi and Nehru and Jinnah, we have sidelined all these really important historical actors. So Johar also saw a post-nationalist opportunity in unifying a subcontinent. Here he is being commemorated in both India and Pakistan. I love these stamps. And what he said in 1923, he said this in English, these are his words. I had long been convinced that here in this country of hundreds of millions of human beings, intensely attached to religion, and yet infinitely split up into communities, sects, and denominations, Providence had created for us the mission of solving a unique problem and working out a new synthesis, which was nothing less than a federation of faiths. For more than 20 years, I have dreamed the dream of federation, of a federation grander, nobler, and infinitely more spiritual than the United States of America. And today, when many a political Cassandra prophesies a return to the bad old days of Hindu-Muslim dissensions, I still dream that old dream of United Faiths of India. Now, Johar, after this, was put in jail for 4 years. And his poems are actually full of references to imprisonment of various kinds. And here's just one to give you an example. I think I have it on the slide, yes. Dilo jaan saub chuke hum tujhe hai jaane jahan, ab hame khauf hi kya girftari ki. And you can see it as part of love poetry. You can also see it as something patriotic if the beloved is the country, right? The Khilafat movement failed, okay? The Turkish Caliphate was abolished in 1924. That's a whole separate story of Turkish nationalism too. And around that time in 1924 is when Mohani called for, this is a quote, separate Muslim states in India united with Hindu states under a national federal government. And soon after that, Lajpat Rai endorsed the idea of partitioning Punjab and forming smaller provinces, given that there was this reality already of separate electorates for each religious community. And he said that this would mean, quote, a clear partition of India into a Muslim India and a non-Muslim India. So this is all coming 6 years before Iqbal's speech in 1930 in Allahabad. In the next 3 years, many radicals, especially those very immersed in communist literature, became more and more disillusioned with Gandhi's aims and tactics in the Congress Party. So Lala Hardayal, who was a founder of the Ghadar Party in 1913, started to encourage Bismil and Hasrat Mohani to found a new organization, which was called the Hindustan Republican Association, HRA. And the goal of that organization was to create a federated republic of the United States of India. And it would do this through organized armed revolution. Very different from the Congress nationalist story that we are familiar with. And at the same time, Hasrat Mohani was very involved in founding the Indian Communist Party around 1925. It was an underground organization. And the British were working very hard to crush all of this revolutionary activity. They saw it all as this Islamic Bolshevik conspiracy that would just bring down the whole world order. And in fact, Bismil was hanged in 1927. Now, in 1928, the Simon Commission came to Lahore to study constitutional reform. The British are giving in a little bit. But all the different nationalist parties are outraged because the Simon Commission is all white. They don't include any Indians in the discussion. So all these nationalist groups come together in Lahore to demonstrate, and they greet the commission with black flags. And here's a photograph, and then you can see it says in Devanagari, Simon Vapas Jao. In English, Simon Vapas Jao. In Persian script, Simon Vapas Jao. And the protesters are lathi charged. And Lajpat Rai is wounded, and he dies a few months later from the wounds he received at this protest. So partly to avenge his death, 3 members of the HRA, of the Hindustan Republican Association, make a plan. And these were Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, and Rajguru. And they go and assassinate the Assistant Superintendent of Police, J.P. Saunders. And this was not a popular action. But when the 3 of them are in jail, they launch a campaign within jail for the rights of political prisoners. And that movement became very popular. And just again to remember how young, I mean, just the tenderness of their youth is so apparent in these photographs. They went on, this is Bhagat Singh in jail. When they went on hunger strike in 1929, 5,000 people gathered in parks in Amritsar to recite poems in which they compared these boys and their love of poetry, their love of their country, to the stories of Heer Ranjha and Soni Mehiwal. They used that comparison. After this, the boys are sentenced to death. And Iqbal's speech about a Muslim India within India in 1930 happens 2 months after the announcement of that sentence. And it's happening in the middle of a huge Punjab-wide campaign to appeal Bhagat Singh's sentence. Petitions everywhere. Everyone is trying to stop this from happening. And so in this moment, Bhagat Singh was as popular as Gandhi, and within Punjab, more popular than Gandhi. And he was hanged in 1931 when Gandhi was in London for the Second Roundtable Conference. And here are the headlines from the Tribune that day. The Roundtable Conferences came about in 1930-31 because Congress had finally at that moment agreed to demand Purna Swaraj, total independence, in 1930. It too had been radicalized by the aftermath of the Simon Commission. And a global stock market crash had happened in 1929, which produced really high unemployment, and that also was fueling civil disobedience and radicalism. So they had to move to the left. But with Bhagat Singh sentenced to death, Punjabis remained alienated from Congress. Gandhi continued to refer to him and his comrades as murderers and terrorists, denying the truth of their prison satyagraha. So this is a crucial context, I think, for understanding Iqbal's thinking about Punjab's future in 1930. And so is the appeal of creating a new Medina after the collapse of the Turkish Caliphate. It's also crucial to understanding the simultaneous launching in that very same moment of a literary movement known as the Progressive Movement. So this is also related to the Simon Commission. There was an American-trained engineer named Gurbaksh Singh who accompanied the Simon Commission to Lahore. He was a railway service employee, so he went with them. And he saw what happened there, and he saw everything that happened after the Simon Commission up to Bhagat Singh's execution, and he became radicalized. He quit his job in the railway service in 1933, the year that Pakistan, that word, enters our language, and he instead establishes a literary magazine that's called Preet Ladi. And he also founds an artist colony called Preet Nagar, which is halfway between Lahore and Amritsar. It still exists. And a lot of progressive writers would meet there, including people like Sahil Ludhianvi, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Amrita Pritam. And the Preet in Preet Nagar and Preet Ladi is important. It's the same theme, right, of drawing on the same love theme. And Preet Ladi, that magazine, was very popular in California too, among Punjabis. And that was the magazine that published Amrita Pritam's poem, Aaj Aankhain Hamari Shani, in 1947. So in 1933, when all this was happening, another writer was in London. This was Sajjad Zahir. He was there the same time as Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. And he had come there, here's a picture of him, after a scandal in Lucknow. The year before, he and 3 other Urdu writers had published a collection of radical short stories in Lucknow, and the book was called Angare, and it was banned as blasphemous. And Zahir went to England, and he met other Indian intellectuals and students there, like M.D. Tasir, Mulk Raj Anand, and they all decided they were going to create a new movement that would be a league of progressive writers. And what they were doing was not particularly Indian, it wasn't unique. All writers were doing this in this moment. They were part of a global trend. So the stock market crash had affected Europe too, and people were already disillusioned there from the war. And this is when you get the turn towards fascism and communism in Europe. And so there's this polarized context of right and left. And it becomes a decade of commitment for intellectuals all over Europe. So writers start to claim that they are more than just writers, that they have a really important political and social role in this time when the stakes are so high. It's a war between fascism and communism. It's a war of ideas. So they're claiming a special role in history, and so are Indian writers. So there are these big meetings of writers with revolutionary commitments happening in Paris, happening in Madrid, as the Nazis are coming to power in Germany in 1933. In Moscow in 1934, there's the first Soviet Writers' Congress, and then in 1935, there's the first International Congress of Writers for the Defense of Culture, and that meets in Paris. And Sajid Zahir goes to that meeting too. And the next year, the Spanish Civil War starts, which is a war between fascism and communism. And a lot of British writers that Sajid Zahir knew, people like Ralph Fox, go and fight for the Republican side, for the communist side in the Spanish Civil War. So they're seeing writers who are taking on this activist role. In England, at the same time, you have the Left Book Club movement, which is, writers again launching this movement to help move British public opinion towards the left. This is a common trend through literary communities in many parts of the world where writers are asserting that they matter. So against this global backdrop, in December 1935, in Allahabad, the authors of Angare met with other Indian writers. They met with Premchand, with Josh Malihabadi, and they get the support of Firaq Gorakhpuri. And within months, they hold their first formal meeting as the Progressive Writers Association. And its organizational structure was modeled on the European movement. The Indian Progressive Writers Association was the Indian branch. It was an affiliate of the International Congress of World Writers. Now, progressives were passionately anti-British, but they wanted to infuse the mainstream nationalist movement with a social and political project that they felt it lacked. They wanted a broader transformation of social and economic relationships in India to make India truly free. And a lot of communists joined the movement, people like Hasrat Mohani, and Urdu readers took the lead in its formation. They had a sort of disproportionate influence at the national level. And in 1937, the group joined with a meeting of the Kisan Sabha, another communist farmers movement at this time. There was a meeting in Amritsar of the Kisan Sabha, and Fez was there, Fez Ahmed Fez. He was a leading labor activist in Punjab, and he made a speech there and said that middle-class writers can and should relate to peasants and workers and other social classes. And after this, Sajid Zahir went to Lahore. He got Iqbal's blessing for the Progressive Writers Movement. He got Tagore's blessing. Jawaharlal Nehru gave his blessing. Now, Jawaharlal Nehru spoke at the group's conference in 1938, and he said that they must include writers only in their group. They should not include politicians like him. And he said this even though he was already a literary figure in his own right. But he didn't understand that the entire point of the group was to try and transcend the divide between writer and politician. And in a sense, by giving center stage always to Nehru, Gandhi, and Jinnah, we have kind of fulfilled his wish that we leave these writers on the sidelines of history. Now, as the progressive movement began to take off, the British declared that India was at war in 1939. And Nehru again urged the progressives to prioritize the nationalist movement. He launches the Quit India campaign, and he wants the progressives to fall in line with him. But many of them didn't. Many of them thought that this was a war against fascism and for communism, and the Soviet Union was leading that struggle for communism, and the British are on the Soviet side, so they support the British war effort. And Fez had just married a British communist and poet, Alice George. You can see them. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to show you. This is a picture of the first Lucknow meeting of the progressive writers. And this is a picture of Fez and Alice. And he joined the army, the British Indian Army, during the war, and he worked on publicity. He was decorated for his military service. Kaifi Azmi and Makhdum Mohyuddin also supported the British war effort for similar reasons. So in general, progressives did not consistently toe any line, whether nationalist or communist or even progressive. Their ideas and their positions were very diverse and evolving over time. Partition forced them to constrain their complex and diverse ideas of nation, religion, gender, community, language, and genre within either the Indian or Pakistani national frame and national narrative. But this is still not what they did at first. It took time for them to constrain themselves in those frames. So I'm going to table here the narrative of the actual unfolding of partition, how it became the plan, how the plan came to have the shape that it did. The material fact is that all those decisions about separation versus federation, who gets which parts of the land, who gets which parts of the infrastructure, which people should people move, all those decisions were very hasty and made at the last minute. So there was a lot of confusion about what was going on. And until the last minute, alternative plans kept emerging. Let's make Calcutta an independent city-state. Let's make Delhi an independent city-state. Let's make a united independent Bengal. No one knew what was actually going to happen. We know looking back, but no one knew in the moment. So you have to use your imagination a little to get back in that moment. Some of you were there in that moment, I know. So some people moved, right, immediately, out of fear. Some moved for more practical reasons. Some moved by accident. Some moved out of conviction. They really believed in what partition was going to create. Many moved because they were hounded out systematically. And the choice to move was often not real, even for elites. And the limiting case of that is when you hear of women who chose to throw themselves in wells. And it's not a real choice, right? So the choice is not real, even for elites. In the end, 12 to 15 million people migrated, and this is the single biggest mass migration in human history ever. And it killed between 500,000 to 2 million people. But still, it was not obvious in that moment that partition would mean partition, that partition would mean total separation. Many people, including many political leaders, thought that this was a temporary thing. And that's why people buried their jewelry in the floors and walls of their homes. They thought they'll go back and get it, or go back and stay there. And a lot of critical government functions remained shared. Pakistan's currency was printed in India. The Reserve Bank of India was the state bank for both Pakistan and India through 1948. People on the border were celebrating Baisakhi together. You could cross back and forth legally without obstruction for many years after 1947. So a lot of people moved late, or they lived binationally. They went back and forth for years. And many of our poets' movements were like that. Their delayed and often tormented movements after 1947 show that for a period of time, both these bins of history, Pakistan and India, still had a lot of possibilities. And the relationship between them had a lot of possibilities, at least until the 1965 war. So let me give you some examples. So Sahil Ludhianvi, this is a later picture of him with my father's favorite Punjabi poet, Shiv Kumar Batalvi, the year before Batalvi died. This is in Bombay. So Sahil Ludhianvi was in Lahore in 1943, but he was a communist, and his views made him a target of the new government of Pakistan. So in 1949, he left, and he went to Delhi. He wound up in Bombay, and he became part of that Bombay film industry image of the love and homeland that I showed you at the beginning. Now, it's not that he loved the India he found. He remained critical of the India. He remained a progressive. So we know in 1957, in the movie Pyasa, which was a film about a disillusioned poet, he asked, "Jinhe naaz hai Hind par wo kahan hai?" And it's important to remember that that poem was a very slightly modified version of a poem that he published in 1944, before independence. So as far as he was concerned, the struggle was still going on. Nothing has been fulfilled by 1947.